Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Cisco Optics Podcast, where we talk about pluggable optics for networks. Coherent optics have been the go-to solution for high-end optical transport systems for years. Eventually, these optics were modularized, and with recent advances in DSP design and optics manufacturing, this technology is now available in small form-factor pluggable modules. In March of 2021, Cisco recognized the importance of this technology and acquired the industry's leader by far in this space, Acacia Communications. This is episode 24, and we conclude our conversation with Tom Williams. Tom joined Cisco through the Acacia acquisition in 2021. We talk about the future of coherent optics. Tom leads marketing efforts for the Acacia Coherent Optics team that was acquired by Cisco in March 2021. Tom has spent over 20 years developing optical transmission equipment ranging from 10 gig to 1.2 terabit. He participates in a variety of coherent standardization activities in OIF, IEEE, and Open ROADM, and is co-chair of the OpenZR Plus MSA. Tom spent nearly 15 years in various management roles at Optium, where he participated in the company's 2006 IPO and 2008 acquisition by Finisar. Tom joined Acacia in 2015, where his role has included corporate and product marketing responsibility, as well as contributing to product roadmap definitions. And as I've said before, all roads seem to lead to Cisco. Please follow us on Apple Podcast or subscribe on whatever podcasting platform you use. We're actually part of the Cisco Podcast Network. Check out our blog at blogs.cisco.com and search on hashtag Cisco Optics Blog. All one word, no hyphen, and no spaces. You'll find podcast episode notes with timestamps there. For our YouTube playlist, go to youtube.com and search on Cisco Optics. And for product information, go to cisco.com/go/optics. And now join me as I talk with Tom Williams. So, 400G ZR was done by OIF. What's next? What do you see next, whether it's OIF or some other standards body?
So, going through, we tend to think about it in three main categories in terms of this 400 gig generation. So 400ZR was done first. Open ROADM defined a carrier-based solution with higher performance and more functionality and kind of the OTN framing the carriers needed. And then there's what's called an OpenZR Plus MSA that kind of took some of the performance elements of Open ROADM and put it back into an Ethernet optimized solution that plugs into a router and sort of is the balance between the two things, because 400ZR was very laser focused on a specific use case. But when you look at the broader market, there's a lot of other applications that either want the higher performance, or maybe they want the 400 gig operating model, but they want to be able to drop down to 200 gig so they can address a longer reach, and then OpenZR Plus addresses all of those kinds of things. So those are the three main categories of how we, there's lots of other ways that people use the solutions that are, closely related to that, but they're the main three ways that we think of that generation. And now we're starting to look toward the next generation, and OIF is working on an 800ZR. They're also working on an 800LR that would be a 10-kilometer coherent interface. So that model of coherent continuing to move to shorter reach interfaces continues. Open ROADM started talking about next generation and what comes next. I think all of the discussion seems to be focused around kind of doubling the baud rate so that we can scale, double the data rate, but maintain the same sort of reaches. So you use the same modulation format when you double the format, double the data rate, and that allows you to maintain similar types of reaches in your network.
So you mentioned the 800 gig activity is including a 10-kilometer LR. Do you see, what do you see in terms of the future of coherent optics in pluggable modules? Do you see that it's going to be more prevalent in the shorter reaches going forward?
So I do. I think the individual steps, I think it it's informative to look at copper to fiber transitions is a great model
Mm,
where people always project the end of copper, right? And people are really innovative at coming up with new copper solutions that
that's
push
true.
off that
They're not just sitting
end of copper.
around, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so I while on one hand, yes, I do absolutely believe Coherent is going to continue to migrate to shore, and ultimately, I think Coherent will be used inside data centers. Um, I I also know that direct detect solutions and vendors who are working on those solutions are not going to stand still, and they're going to continue to innovate and come up with new solutions. So our our challenge is always, and that's I think for a lot of people in the standardization activity. I think that's part of what they see going on right now is that what we're doing in coherent standardization today is laying the groundwork for where we ultimately need to go. And we're still working through some very challenging uh, questions in standardization. I would say, um, the coherent standardization has made it so uh, the interfaces can talk to each, can interoperate. I don't think it's quite to the point that client optics is, where if you take vendor A and vendor B, it will interoperate over a well-defined link, and partly because even in something like 400ZR, the links are more complicated. You've got muxes and demuxes and multiple channels, and there's a lot more going on in a link than
Hmm.
just having a fiber between the two interfaces. And so that makes things a bit more complicated, but there's still conversations that the standards bodies are working through that I think is good, important work that needs to be done, because ultimately these are the things that need to be worked out if coherent's going to move to even shorter reaches.
I mean, I think you mentioned something really important. The fact that there are more things going on, that these are pretty complicated, pretty complicated devices. To me, it seems like it's a big barrier to entry. Like you need like really smart, capable people designing these, manufacturing them, maintaining them. Is do you feel the same way? Because I've made statements about just in client optics getting to 100 gig, we start to see the complexity, start to ramp up. And in my opinion, that's kind of a barrier to entry where because there are more things that can go wrong. So you just have to have a better organization underneath your, to make products, right? You have to have a more robust organization behind you to to make sure that everything goes smoothly because there are just so many more things that can go wrong. And if you don't stay on top of them, they will go wrong if you don't take care of it. Is that your view of coherent optics as well? Like, do you think that it's still kind of specialized at this point?
Yeah, I mean, I think what you're touching on there, and I think a lot of the things we talked about with coherent optics and the complexity of all the different functions and um, the signal processing and everything, a lot of that is becoming necessary even in direct detect, right? And DSPs are widely used in direct detect. They're all parallel interfaces, so you've got a lot of different, components and PICs that have a lot of functionality and everything. And so the trade-off becomes a little bit different. They're almost converging in some respect, where we're getting with the integration in coherent, we're sort of simplifying how to make a coherent interface, but also the direct detect is getting more complex as well. And so um, I do think I think it ties back to the capabilities that I saw when I came to Acacia. Um, that's a big part of what has made Acacia successful, I think, is because there's that infrastructure of all of the different expertise and capabilities and everything. And um, I think it really is key, but I think it's becoming key everywhere, right? I think it it really is. All these devices are getting more and more complex, and uh, it, it really is important that you have a broad range of expertise. I think it's the right way to be structured to do these things well.
I, I agree. Sometimes I question myself though, because sometimes I wonder, am I just taking a narrow view? Like, is that expertise required just now because it's still kind of new? Because my opinion is you still need that solid talent base behind you, even in the long term. However, a valid counterpoint would be, well, once it matures, then it starts to become more widely available. And you could look at, say, 10 gig, like as an example. When I've heard, I wasn't in this industry at the time, but when we went from SFP 1 gig to 10 gig SFP plus, I heard a lot of people said, "Oh my God, this is so hard, right? Factor of 10 in the bandwidth. How in the world are we going to do it?" Well, years later, we don't even blink about it now, right? Because whatever hard work was required was done. Now that it's been manufactured in, you know, gazillions, I don't know the exact number, but we're talking millions, right? All those bugs and kinks have been worked out, and now it's relatively accessible technology. So I'm wondering if we just wait long enough, and if the volume ramps up to the same point as 10 gig, years from now we would look back at 400 gig or 100 gig, we'll say 400 gig, in the same light. So I don't know. What do you
I,
think of
I
that?
think I think there's truth to that. I guess two things that stand out to me there. One, I think it is a new element because so much is being done in CMOS today, and the investment model for CMOS is so different than traditional optics at 1 and 10 gig. You know, it requires a different kind of expertise. I think it's a little bit of the optics world transitioning to look a bit more like the electronics world, which I
Mm,
think we've always sort of thought could happen in the future, but I think we're actually living that and seeing that. Um, and I think the other thing, I was listening to your earlier podcast with Mark Noel, and
mm-hmm.
the points he was making about the I think there's a difference in the consumption model, where you now have big volume being driven early in the life cycle of these newer higher data
Mm,
rates. Whereas, the traditional, if you go back to those earlier data rates, even at like 100 gig, where early 100 gig to volume adoption was, lower volume, you know, telecom users buying CFP 100 gigs and everything, and then it migrated through CFP2 before it got to QSFP. Um, and now we see, the first adoption being these big volume
yeah.
users, and that's a really different development model. Um, and it's definitely, I think being able to support that is one of the challenge, and also being able to align. I think the other challenge we all face is getting the requirements across the large adopters, the large hyperscale customers to align, um, well enough to, partly that clarity of, okay, this is the right thing to
Mm-hmm.
develop, and I know that there'll be a market at the end of it. With a silicon investment model, right? You need to know that you're developing the right product, right? You can't invest to develop a bleeding edge CMOS device and then find out that it was the
And then
wrong time.
you,
That's a
you
really expensive mistake.
yeah, expensive both dollars wise and time wise, right? Because it,
Yep.
yeah. So I think that's a really good point about the consumption model being different now. So the 10 gig example that I gave is not actually that equivalent, right? Because with 10 gig, the industry had time to kind of mull over and solve these problems when the volume demands weren't huge. And it's only much later that the volume ramped up, and then I guess the volume was a little bit more aligned with the maturity of the technology. Whereas, like you're saying, starting with 100 gig, that volume has to be there from the get-go. And it's only the really capable people who can provide that advanced technology and volume at the same time. And then a few years later, it's on to the next generation, and we start all over again. The next generation is required in high volume. And again, it's more complex. You got to throw more tools at it from your bag of tools. And so maybe that's the way it's going to go from now on.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see. I think that's the shift that does make it different. I think it's what we all the challenge we all face today, right? Is not just bringing the technology to market, but bringing it to where it's ready to scale quickly when it hits the market.
Well, Tom, it's always fun to try to predict the future, although none of us can actually do it, but it's always a fun exercise. Thanks so much for your time. I really appreciate the conversation. I certainly learned a lot. These are a lot of questions I've had in the back of my mind for a long time, and I really appreciate your explaining these to me.
Yeah, thanks, Pat. It was a lot of fun. I appreciate the opportunity to join.
Thanks again.
Thank you.
That was the final part of my conversation with Tom Williams. Follow us on Apple Podcasts and leave a review, or subscribe on whatever podcasting platform you use. You may see the Cisco Podcast Network come up when you search for Cisco Optics Podcast. That's where we live, and you can find other great podcasts there too. And we'd really appreciate you helping to get the word out. Share this with friends and colleagues that come to mind when you think of network technology and optics. Also, check out the Cisco Optics blogs at blogs.cisco.com and search on hashtag Cisco Optics blog, no spaces and no hyphens. We also have this podcast and educational videos on YouTube. Just go to youtube.com and search on Cisco Optics. Thank you for listening. This is Pat Chow, Product Manager at Cisco Optics. In the next episode, we'll start a brand new conversation with a new guest. Until next time.